Okay, so uh, we are NWSOFA, which stands for Northwest Suburbs Organizing for Action. And we're in the northwest suburbs of Chicago. We have about 5,000 members that cover about 6 townships in the land beyond O'Hare. And it used to be that just about everybody was from this area. But today we have about 15% of our membership from outside of our area, throughout Chicago, Illinois, and we'll even get a person or two from the West Coast and from Ecuador. We're organized on the twin snowflake principle. Mark Lundholm is our climate change lead. And as you can see, we're organized on the dual snowflake principle. In the orange area, you see our communications team that develops these programs. It gets the information out to people, etc. And then on the blue area, these are our 10 issue teams. And at the very top, we started with our gun violence prevention right after Sandy Hook. Shortly after that, we organized a new team on healthcare about 10 years ago, then immigration reform, then social justice a few years later. Then we had our Stand With Women group that works on all things important to women, the ERA, Stand on Women's Choice, etc. We've had a long-term group called Fiscal and Economics, which meets monthly, getting all the basic facts out there. We also have an election outreach group, which works on both our federal, state, and local. And it seems like that group never stops working these days. And of course, climate change, which we have tonight. And then we have 2 ROD groups, which may sound different, but ROD stands for Restoring Our Democracy, or Restore Our Democracy. That's kind of a catch-all group. So they work on voting rights, on elections, on gerrymandering. They'll do issues like vote by mail. They'll do issues on why we should be teaching civics, do issues on what makes the AR-15 a very lethal weapon and why we should not be using it. They really cover the waterfront. And then we have a ROD group that is dealing basically with disinformation. A couple of years ago, it was primarily disinformation oriented to school boards, but now it's a greater scope and working more on stopping hate across the country. That is who we are. We are not NWSOFA. We are Northwest Suburbs Organizing for Action. Mark, I'm going to turn this back to you now.
Yeah, we've got a great group tonight. Thank you all for coming in to the climate change meeting on the NWSOFA-Indivisible, our meeting for August. I'm just thinking, I worked in the environmental field before I retired, and looking at the hurricane stuff, the company I was working for was probably starting to mobilize people to go down and work on the recovery efforts for that hurricane that's going to hit the East Coast. So I've seen that stuff, the aftermath of that. It's getting worse, and we know climate change is here. We just recently had our annual NWSOFA-Indivisible picnic in Bill's backyard. You can see his lake out over his shoulder. Bill, how many people did we have? We had
about 85.
About 85. And we will have even a bigger one a year from now, with a lot of candidates showing up. So be aware that another one will be coming. I gave a little talk. Well, several of us gave talks that we had some candidates and judges and stuff, but some of our NWSOFA people talked about what they do. I sometimes am a fly fisherman, and I get Trout Unlimited's magazine quarterly. And in their spring issue, they had an article on climate change is the #1 threat to fly fishing. And they said, if in this, there are 8 points. If you think you can't do anything, here are things that you can do. #1 is to talk about it. #2 is to assume a leadership role. #3 is to align your actions with your values. Every choice you make can make a difference regarding climate change. #4 was initiate a community-based approach to climate. #5 was discuss habitat, water, and pollutants. #6 was to promote sustainable business. Number 7, promote climate-friendly ideas inside and outside your community. Number 8, focus on what really matters. So it's interesting seeing a great freshwater organization like Trout Unlimited start to put out things like this, that there are actually things people can do. It seems, like such a big problem, and it is, but everything we do can have an effect. The other interesting thing at our picnic, that Indivisible Illinois sent a great handout on what is happening with the Inflation Reduction Act, which in some ways they said really is a reshaping of industrial policy for the country, and nothing like this has been done in 40, 50 years. It's a huge 10-year program. We're just starting to see rollouts of this. They sent Indivisible Illinois sent out a two-sided highlight page on it. And Bill, we should see if we could send this out, get the Indivisible Illinois to agree to let us send these out, because it's a really great handout, so you can see that things are happening. And on the individual thing, you can cut home energy costs, get tax credits for saving on home upgrades, heat pumps, weatherization, heaters, air conditioners, clothes dryers, electric induction stoves, stuff like that. You can get significant rebates to do some of those in your own home. So anyway, it's a great handout, and I just thought I would mention it. But moving on to tonight's presenter, we've got Scott Allen from the Citizens Utility Board. Now, a fair number of you are from Illinois and may know what CUB is and what CUB is doing on our behalf. But I wanted Scott to first give an introduction to himself and talk a little bit about CUB, and then proceed with the program. Scott, is yours.
Mark, you mentioned community-based approach to this sort of thing. I don't think there's anything more important in making changes here in Illinois than having that community-based approach. So yeah, Citizens Utility Board, we are a utility watchdog and consumer advocate, started in 1983 with the Citizens Utility Board Act. The General Assembly thought that it was necessary to have a nonpartisan organization, not-for-profit organization that went to bat for consumers and advocated in front of the General Assembly, the Illinois Commerce Commission, and the courts. So we do a lot of education, a lot of outreach, how people can save money on their bills, but we also do a lot of policy advocacy. That's my job. It is renewable energy policy. And like I said, I am from downstate. I live in Bloomington right now. So there's no shortage of work to be done on that down here. But yeah, when I talk to Mark, I'm thinking in terms of what are we going to do in this state to do our part to fight climate change. The Inflation Reduction Act was a game changer. It really changed the landscape of what's possible. And a lot of this, in order to make like system and economy-wide change, is going to require the General Assembly to make some decisions that aren't very popular. And they're a little bit scary to, especially, I think, more of the people down my way. So that's what I wanted to talk about tonight, and kind of what fight CUB is engaged in. So, excuse me, just as a reminder of our timeline in terms of emissions reductions from the electricity generation sector, all coal has to be shut down by 2030. Well, there are two major caveats to that. The publicly owned coal plants get a pass, and that has huge implications. The publicly owned coal plants being the Prairie State Generating Campus down in Marissa, Illinois, and the Dahlman coal plant in the city of Springfield. So by 2030, all but 2 of those coal plants should be shut down. Some of these coal plants you see here are closing a little bit ahead of schedule. And by 2035, we're going to start phasing out gas, the dirtier gas plants, especially in environmental justice communities. By 2040, All other remaining gas plants have to close. Any private gas plants and public coal plants will have to be shuttered completely by 2045, unless they can find a way to capture 100% of their CO2 emissions, which is unlikely. And the CO2 emissions thing we'll come back to, because that's a pretty important fight right now in Illinois. How are we doing on this since we passed CEJA? We're way behind. The adjustable block program, or Illinois Shines, which is how all the money flows through the state in form of renewable energy credits and gets people to build solar and wind. It has flaws, and we need to work those flaws out. It is a new program and it's massive, so some of that is understandable, but we need to fix that. Transmission, we are way behind on building transmission. And there is a massive amount of renewable energy in what we call the queue, either at the utility level, so at the ComEd and Ameren level. This is particularly bad in Ameren territory, or MISO, the Mid-Continent Independent System Operator, which is the grid operator for this part of the state. And then for I guess most of you, the part of the state, it's PJM is the grid operator. We've known that transmission was an issue for at least 10 years. It's MISO's job to make sure that electricity is available when it's needed, and then it's their job to get it where it's needed. They've been hesitant to push their members, who are utilities. ComEd and Ameren are members of these organizations. They've been hesitant to tell them that it's time to start spending money in building transmission. We're seeing a lot of renewed hostility. I think the wind hostility has always been present in the state, or at least for the last decade. We're seeing now anti-solar, a lot of anti-solar people starting to come out. Again, particularly in this part of the state where we have a lot of wind, and then down south where we're expected to see a lot more solar. It's getting harder and harder to get those counties that have been closed off to open up. The publicly owned utilities aren't doing their part. The rest of us, Ameren and ComEd customers, and I will say that I lived in the city of Springfield for a long time. It's a publicly owned utility. They are way behind on planning for a grid transformation for Springfield and for most of the municipal utilities in the state, and the cooperative utilities too, who own part of that Prairie State coal plant. They have no plans to get off of that in time. We need that plant shut down yesterday. But as it sits, we're looking at it running for another 20 years or so. And then the carbon capture usage and sequestration issue is really prevalent in the state right now. My opinion is, and I think this opinion is shared by a lot of others too, is that carbon capture, particularly on coal plants, is a false solution. It's spending hundreds of millions of billions of dollars on these carbon capture projects on coal plants that I don't think there's any expectation that it's actually going to work. There are tax credits now for private interests to get involved and build these carbon capture plants. And I think their main goal over the next 10 or so years is to collect as much money as they can through those 45Q tax credits. And I don't really care how well this works, as long as they get paid. So how is the General Assembly going to deal with this? It's never easy to predict that, but the Illinois Power Agency on the adjustable block program, trying to get that fixed. The Illinois Power Agency, that's the agency that was responsible for procuring electricity in the state. So, for example, if you're a ComEd customer and you don't go out and make a deal with one of the 100 electricity suppliers out there, you get your electricity supplied by ComEd, but really that electricity is purchased by the Illinois Power Agency, and then they pass it through the utility to you. So they have a long-term renewable resources procurement plan that gets updated every year, where they try to identify, why are we not making our goals? Are we not why and in which parts of the state are we not building enough renewable energy? What do we need to do to fix that? And so they're very good at their job. So there is some hope there that they can get us back on track. But all of these other things need to fall in line too. The Power Agency doesn't have much say over what these grid operators do or how individuals treat individuals or individual units of government treat these renewable energy projects. We are about to see a massive amount of spending on transmission, particularly in this part of the state. Again, the NIMBY thing is going to come into play here, but the bottom line is we have to have these transmission lines if we want to be able to bring all of this renewable energy onto the grid. You have to be able to move it around. Recently, in this past legislative session, Ameren proposed they wanted a right of first refusal on any transmission built in the state, which would essentially make them a transmission monopoly. Fortunately, just the other day, the governor vetoed that. Gov was very vocal against that and not allowing Ameren to be a monopoly or a transmission monopoly. So that means that Ameren is going to have to compete with every other builder of transmission out there to ensure that we get the lowest price on building that transmission. On the siting of renewable energy, there was a bill passed at the first of the year that said that at the county level, no county in the state is allowed to zone in a way that keeps wind or solar out of their counties. Previously, I think 12 counties did have explicit policies saying you can't build renewable energy here. The problem that we've seen is that there are counties who have flat out said that they will not comply with the law. Some towns within those counties, I think Pontiac, for example, has figured out that, well, some of this land where people want to build these big solar projects fall within our municipal boundaries, and the law doesn't say anything about us keeping them out that way. The publicly owned utilities, the good news for them is that the Inflation Reduction Act provides direct pay instead of a tax credit. So the reason it was hard for, say, a school to build renewable energy is a lot of the way, or a big chunk of those projects are paid for by one, renewable energy credits, a check from the state to build that solar, and two, a 30% federal tax credit. Well, if you're a not-for-profit, if you're a not-for-profit entity, you don't pay federal taxes, therefore you're not able to get to 30%. So the IRA said that instead of that, we will pay you upfront whatever the equivalent of that 30% would be. My work right now is focused on publicly owned utilities and getting some transparency requirements so that the people who own those utilities can participate in the planning process. They can have access to the agencies that got them into these long-term coal contracts. And there's a lot of momentum for that up in Naperville and in Batavia and St. Charles and Geneva, a little bit building down here, but our goal is to get the publicly owned utilities on par with the rest of the state in terms of their climate goals and their emissions reduction goals and their planning. Carbon capture, this is maybe the most exciting right in front of us. We expect in veto session, negotiations are happening right now. BP teamed up with some industry partners here in Illinois, and they wrote a bill making very favorable to them when it comes to carbon capture. But the Illinois Clean Jobs Coalition, we kind of stepped in and said, well, we should probably be at the table for this too. And at that point, the industry people walked away from it because they didn't want to have to negotiate with environmental people. Fortunately, the governor didn't like that, so he forced everybody back to the table. They're negotiating right now, and the governor is really hopeful to have a bill in veto session. And so what this bill would do, ideally, is to put some pretty tight restrictions around pipelines, CO2 pipelines, the carbon capture itself, and on the sequestration part of it. So property rights and who owns that pore space and all of that stuff. So the idea behind it is to delay and deter any investment in any infrastructure that would keep fossil fuels burning longer in the state, which is what carbon capture is mostly incentivized to do. On the other side of that, so if we think that the Future Energy Jobs Act, the Climate and Equitable Jobs Act did a lot to decarbonize the electric generation sector, a lot of the policy focus, especially by the big environmental organizations, is shifting to buildings. Up in the northern part of the state, pollution from buildings, so that's gas being in for heating and heating, cooking, water heat, is responsible for about 2/3 of the emissions in the northern part of the state. So CEJA gave us a good foundation. It said that we needed to develop better building codes. The Inflation Reduction Act provides billions of dollars to incentivize people at the individual level to switch from, say, a gas stove to induction cooking. But the state is going to have to act, and we're going to have to figure out as a state how we see the future of gas in homes. A lot of other states are handling this too. It's called the Future of Gas Docket. And basically, it's laying out a plan to unwind the gas business. So telling NICOR and Peoples and North Shore and Ameren that you guys got to figure out another way to make money because we intend to not have gas in buildings. We expect to have the first big bill on this in the spring session. Obviously, the gas companies don't like this at all. They know that it's coming, but especially if you're a People's Gas customer, but also NICOR, you'll notice that the fixed charges on your bill are pretty high, and that is those gas companies squeezing out the last few dollars, building as much infrastructure as they can so that they can recover that from ratepayers. But I think they know that the end of their business is coming. They're not going to give it up easily. And plus, we're seeing more and more research that shows that the impacts on human health for indoor gas use is much worse than we thought. And that's particularly true for the people who can kind of least afford to electrify their homes. You live in a smaller, older apartment building, doesn't have adequate ventilation. The risks for not just asthma, but other negative impacts goes up considerably. So this clean buildings thing is a priority for CUB. So our job is to kind of help educate and protect individual consumers. And this is what has a huge impact on them: the unaffordability of gas, and the inability to be able to equitably transition with everybody else that may have enough money to front this. So we have a lot of concerns there. Transportation is kind of the third big source of pollution, and this one is tricky. As of now, there's no clear path forward in the legislature for what we're going to do to solve this problem. CEJA did give us a good foundation to stand on, and the law said that our intent in Illinois is to replace the equivalent of 1 million gas and diesel vehicles. Didn't really say how we were going to do that, though. The governor was excited about it, and he kind of jumped the gun and I think misspoke at a press conference and said that we're giving rebates to everybody. And so that was great, but that money ran out very quickly because it wasn't expected. And frankly, the way that we solve this isn't by putting an EV in every driveway. It's making some huge changes to how we use transportation. And so that's what advocates are kind of torn. Some of them are working on heavy vehicles. Some of them are working on EV rebates. Some of them are working on making walkable communities. And as far as I know, there's been no kind of theory of everything out there that can tie all of this work together and say, this is how we go forward. And plus, to be honest, the governor's office hasn't been great on doing some really simple things like signing the California emissions pledge, which would eliminate diesel emissions from heavy trucks by 2030, I believe. And not sure why that is, but so this one's a little less clear to me, and I think to everybody else is, what are we going to do? Like I said, Cub's priorities, even though we're consumer advocates, it says in the Cub Act that we are to promote the health, welfare, and prosperity of all citizens of the state. And that's kind of how I get to do my job. So yeah, clean energy and healthy air is really important to Cub, but we also want to make sure that it is done equitably. My focus, as I said, are on the publicly owned utilities. That's a little bit outside of Cub's purview. We haven't really done much of that work, but I have dragged Cub kicking and screaming into that venue. And I'm working with volunteers and people from all over the state to make some changes there. Yeah, like I said, we have to get the transmission stuff right. We need to make this affordable for everybody. And the gas industry is kind of doing a takeover of all of these kind of trade associations or the group of consumer advocates from across the country. Those events are all sponsored by gas companies. They've kind of infiltrated everywhere they could, and they're using that to push these ideas that, well, gas is really actually pretty clean, so it's kind of silly to be getting off of gas when it's such a good value for the efficiency. And so we have to resist that and push forward anyway. So I'll cut it off there and leave my email address up if anybody, or I can put it in the chat too. I'll stop sharing and put my email address in the chat, but happy to take questions.
Oh, thank you. Lucky me. So, I am a longtime environmentalist, safe energy person. I was organizing protests against nuclear power plants in the late 1970s, longtime supporter of Cub. It seems to me, though, that we're kind of putting the cart before the horse, because if we've got laws passed that say these coal plants must shut down and then the gas burning power plants must shut down, but at the same time, we're being stymied in building transmission, and we're being stymied in building renewables. That's just pushing us into nukes, and that's out of the frying pan and into the fire. Illinois is dotted with in-process nuclear disasters from the 8 or 10 nukes that are around us. So there's nowhere for the waste to go. So I don't know. It just seems that we need to overcome the barriers to solar and wind before we shut down the gas plants.
Yeah, and you're right about that. And we definitely don't want to get into a situation where we have to rely on the nuclear plants any longer than we need to. And we don't, I don't think anybody's crazy enough to build nuclear plants. Who knows, though, with federal money. But the intention of CEJA was to build that off ramp instead of saying that. We're pretty confident that we could do without the coal plants in the state, given the amount of nuclear energy we have and given the amount of gas. But one, we didn't want to incentivize this kind of rush into the state to build more gas plants than we need and just export that excess generation to Indiana or Kentucky. Instead, give an off ramp to gas. And as gas ramps down and winds down, battery technology, storage technology becomes more widespread and more affordable, and it gives us time to build the transmission and the renewable energy that we need. So yeah, we're not saying that we need to shut all of this down by 2030. That definitely wouldn't work.
Scott, do you want to say anything about microgrid development and stuff? And I know we did have a program, I don't know if it's from you or with Sierra Club, on the electric school buses. And all those things are good. But anyway, keep going.
No, yeah, microgrids are really interesting. And I know that there's a really cool microgrid project in, not back in the yards, but is Altgeld Gardens, I think.
And what exactly is it, if you can describe it?
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah. So the idea of a microgrid is that you have various sources of generate, like you might have wind, you might have solar, you might have batteries, and that grid can operate sort of independently for a small area. In the case of the one in, I believe it's Altgeld Gardens, it could supply out. Well, I'll give a better example. Ameren had a microgrid test project in Champaign-Urbana. It's probably still there, where they had wind, solar, storage, and then a diesel generator, which I don't know why they had that, but they would test that out. They hooked it up to an apartment building near campus, and they were trying to figure out how they could reduce or eliminate a brownout time or blackout time by switching from powering that building just by the microgrid. And then when the microgrid couldn't keep up, they would switch it back to the main grid. And so it's being, some resiliency to what it was called islanding. So you can run just off of that grid, island yourself. You're not connected to the main grid. And there are a lot of kind of experiments going on a smaller scale with this. I don't think Ameren and ComEd, well, ComEd's in partnership with one, but it's illegal for the utilities to make electricity in Illinois, for Ameren and ComEd to make electricity. So that's why it's a little bit more difficult for them. So that will have to come through federal funding. And with all this federal funding available, I wouldn't be surprised if we see some new, smaller microgrid projects in the state.
I would think that the downstate communities might be really interested in having microgrids. Why would they fight it? It doesn't make sense to me, but then.
Some of them are. The city of Carbondale is pursuing the idea of maybe not a microgrid, but for building enough renewable energy to supply their own needs, but they would stay connected to the larger grid. So I think we will see more of those ideas.
So look at the questions, Jim.
Yeah, Jim, I've actually heard the Killdeer case, and it's kind of I am definitely not a lawyer, so I'll lead with that. But it's a bit of a gray area. We know of cases where, for example, a homeowners association can't keep you from installing solar on your house, but when it comes from at the municipal level, ordinances, yeah, it seems to be within their purview to make ordinances that make it illegal to, or at least very, very difficult to install solar. And that's one of the things, again, that we need a better solar bill of rights for people in the state.
I know Mike Zanilla was the guy that lives there who's trying to get the ordinances changed. So he's working with residents to try to get a citizens change of the legislation so they'll allow it. We'll see what that happens. But he's with Citizens Climate Lobby and was on with us last month, or was it the month before? He does really good. He really knows his stuff. And interestingly, we mentioned nuclear, and Representative Mark Walker was at the picnic, and Mark Walker's bill was the nuclear bill that was passed. Mark Walker's bill. He was really pissed that Pritzker mandatory vetoed the nuclear provision in it. And I don't know if any comments about it. He was really pissed off at Sierra Club for sticking its spoke in the wheel. Where do we see nuclear going? Thorium reactors down the road might provide a much better alternative. I still can't get past the waste problem, but maybe that's just me and I'm not a nuclear expert. But anyway, any comments? If a rewrite on the bill might make things more palatable, where's Cub heading on this?
Cub on the nuclear thing, like, we're not pro-nuclear at all. The way that we view it is that having these nuclear plants, like, one of the only benefits from having them is that they will allow us to do a pretty aggressive transition to renewables without needing to build a bunch of gas. But Cub would prefer to see them go away, and definitely not giving any more public money to bail them out.
And for those of you who don't know, the Price-Anderson Act put the insurance liability for nuclear on the public. No insurance company would touch nuclear. And so we get to pay for any problems. So anyway.
Yeah, I'm glad that the governor vetoed that bill, just personally. I don't think, again, Cub hasn't really made a statement on that. I'm glad that the governor vetoed it. I think that I don't know. I'm definitely, this is outside of my technical understandings, but if we're going to have any sort of nuclear generation in the state, some new technology, I think it should be owned by the state. For one, I don't think that we should allow, well, I think all electricity should be owned by the state, but that's keep that amongst us.
Owned by the people.
Yeah. Yeah. So we'll see. There have been threats on the Democrat side of overturning the veto, but it's unclear whether or not they have enough to overturn that. So we'll see.
So let's look at the questions.
Yeah, on workforce, another thing that CEJA did was create these workforce hubs, these workforce programs for individuals, one, but for existing contractors who want to sort of ramp up and tie into the bigger contracting world. And then an incubator program also for somebody who wants to become a contractor and learn how to like tie into supply chains and that sort of thing. So, excuse me, I think that yes, we'll see these workforce hubs opening pretty soon. And again, there's an emphasis on equity. So we're targeting people who are foster care alum from environmental justice communities. And if you come from a former energy community, so if you just had a coal plant shut down in your community, those people will get priority placement in these workforce programs. And so, yeah, I think our workforce is going to be prepared. I think where we might come into some dangers, we needed a whole army of people prepared to work in the energy efficiency field. So doing like retrofits, doing energy audits, doing installations, especially in multifamily buildings. We don't have an adequate workforce for that right now. So I hope that people diversify a little bit and they don't all want to go like install solar panels. And that'll be, most of that work is union work too. So, that's good for those folks who can get on that track. Why has Illinois been chosen for CO2 disposal? Again, along with not being a lawyer, I'm not a geologist, but if you believe what the people at the University of Illinois Prairie Research Institute say, Illinois' geology is perfect for its formations, and limestone and all of that stuff is perfect to contain massive amounts of carbon dioxide. I have very little confidence that that is true, and I don't think that anybody can be assured of what happens when you pump that much CO2 into the ground. But that's the claim, is that we just have kind of the perfect geologic formations in the Mount Simon Basin. And I don't know, it's irrelevant to me, really. Like, I just don't think we should be doing that.
Is that in the same area where companies were trying to frack gas down in southern part of the state?
Yeah, it's most of the southern half of the state. And yeah, that's why we're unique. So pump all of your garbage to Illinois, and we'll hope that we don't have some kind of massive leak at some point in the future, and then all of that sequestered carbon suddenly becomes unsequestered.
And an explosion. Let's see. So look at more questions.
Fault line. We have the New Madras earthquake.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. Oh, that.
From Nashville to St. Louis, and it affects us.
Yeah.
So that's in that area. So you have an earthquake hit that area, and that's all out.
Yeah.
Oh, well, yeah, really.
And Marcy, I can't recall exactly what I said about Champaign. So you'll have to remind me.
With the microgrid, it was a microgrid.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you can see it from, is it Prospect, the street that runs in front of, it kind of runs past the university's coal plant, right on the edge of campus. Ameren has an office there right on the edge of campus. And if that wind turbine's still there, you can see it off of the road. Energy efficiency is a source of energy itself. That's in a way that, so when we have capacity, so energy is the electricity that we're using right now. And then capacity is the promise for generators to be able to deliver electricity when demand is at its highest. So if I own an energy plant, whatever plant, and it generates 350 megawatts of electricity, I can bid into the auction, the capacity auction, and say that I promise to deliver 50 megawatts of electricity anytime you demand it. And in addition to just bidding in energy generation, people bid in battery storage, for example. Our battery storage, we can promise this much capacity if you want it. And then energy efficiency measures are also bid in. So that's like demand response programs. So ComEd, for example, has their AC cycling program, and they know how many customers are signed up for that. So all of that can be bid in, and it's really it's a way of calling on people to reduce their usage at peak times. And so it really saves us from needing so much capacity during those peak times. And so it just reduces the amount of electricity that we need during those peaks. But yes, energy efficiency is, again, some low-hanging fruit that if we can improve our energy efficiency, that reduces stress on the grid. It shaves those peaks. So, when we're at peak demand, the plants that turn on to meet that demand are the dirtiest plants we have. They're those really dirty gas plants that fire up to meet that demand. And so the more we reduce at those highest times during the summer, the better off we are in terms of pollution and in terms of cost.
I have a question about solar farms. I don't know if you have any updates on it. I'm not able to put solar in my condo units here without great difficulty. So I did subscribe with Nexamp, and it's proved to be, a real plus as far as I can tell, with no downside. What's the state of solar farms? Is there a big fight back downstate against those too? And if people want to find out about signing up with these things, they should probably contact Cub, you guys at Cub, or any comments?
Yeah, and I could put a link in the chat too, to our fact sheet on community. So what's not a fact sheet? It's we keep track of all the current community solar deals. And yeah, there are still a lot of community solar offers out there. Community solar sites are being built every year. They go through the adjustable block program, and then we build more. So subscriptions are always coming up. Same with the Solar for All program, which is targeted at income qualified people. On community solar is a safe bet, because when it's just regular community solar, and by that I mean not targeted at, not specifically in the low income program, the suppliers don't, or the developers don't have to offer any kind of savings, but they do, anywhere from 10 to 20%. And so that means that you subscribe. If your subscription generates 80 kilowatt hour or 100 kilowatt hours and you use 110, that means you have to buy 10 kilowatt hours off the grid. And so that 20% discount means that this company is giving you 20% off of the supply that you have to purchase from the grid. So yeah, those are good deals. There are a ton of them still out there. I would obviously, I'll put a link in the chat, but I would try to get one of the 20% or the 20% discount ones rather than the 10. But it's kind of like, you have to call them, see if there's a wait list, see how long that wait list is. But
does Cub have a review of these companies, and you can sort of figure out who's better than somebody, or there's a spreadsheet to have on those outfits?
Yeah. So what I'll link is a chart, and that chart describes all of the like not requirements, but what kind of discount they offer. Do they do a credit check? Do they do separate billing? So we lay out all the different components, and we don't endorse one provider over another. We just make the information available so that people can make that choice. Like I said, the biggest thing seems to be, one company might offer a 10% supply discount, the other might offer a 20, and it's obviously 20 is bigger than 10. See if they have room. The status of net metering. So another thing that CEJA did was said that Ameren and ComEd no longer have to offer one-to-one net metering on the distribution side of your bill in 2025. So in 2025, we will see that part end. And so you will still be able to get credits on your bill for the supply side, but that incentive will be pretty it'll be greatly decreased. But in place of net metering from Ameren and from ComEd, they will have to offer what has been referred to as a distributed generation rebate. And I think both ComEd and Ameren are already kind of testing this out to see what works. So you have the option to, if you want to forego right now, if you install solar and you want to forego that net metering from Ameren, you can take their rebate instead. And a lot of people are doing that. So, yeah, we'll see how that works out. For all the people who get in under that 2025 deadline, you'll be legacied in under the net metering program indefinitely. That it will probably end at some point, though.
So I see Carrie's question in there about community solar being both wind and solar farm. Somebody at the picnic was also asking about that, and I don't know of any companies that are doing both, but maybe you do. Cub has a resource to find out about that.
Well, no, right now there aren't any of those there are no wind subscription programs. And I think I don't know why exactly. It's the economics of it. And there's no funding category for that. So we could potentially, or I guess in theory, the Illinois Power Agency, we could create a funding category for community wind, I suppose. And that might be something that happens in the future. I'm not sure. And when it comes to the wind, like the smaller wind turbines too, there are people that use those, the smaller ones, but again, it comes down to economics. It's not really, I guess, cost efficient. But if money isn't a problem for you, beware of zoning restrictions and all that stuff, and go for it. Yes,
Peter Moore is one of the local. He's sort of the guru of solar around here. I don't know, Scott, if you know of him.
Yep.
But he has solar in his house, and he also subscribes to Nexamp, so he gets double bang for the buck, and I think it's worked really well for him. So,
yeah, definitely. And yeah, Bob, current net metering customers will be carried through. So if you get in before that January 1, 2025 deadline, you'll be carried through. I would imagine that at some point there will be some kind of push to end net metering, or ComEd and Ameren will eventually go to the Commerce Commission, I would bet, at some point in the future, and say that for all of those customers that we've allowed to carry through, like, we want to shut that down. So I don't know if they'll say that, well, you have to give everybody 20 years or 10 years or 15 years, and then you can roll them off, or what that would look like. But I would imagine that eventually that will happen. The bill to end net metering was when the Future Energy Jobs Act passed. So it was kind of always understood that net metering was not going to carry on forever. And then the Future Energy Jobs Act in 2016 said that once Ameren territory and ComEd territory, once 5% of the energy generated in those territories comes from behind the meter, like small distributed generation, like residential, then the utilities would be allowed to end that. And it got really crazy a couple of years ago because Ameren had some calculations and they said, yeah, we've hit our 5%, we're shutting it down. And they did for a few days. And then the Commerce Commission said, nah, don't think so. We don't come up with the same numbers. You have to start it back up. And so we just fixed that in CEJA by saying that instead of guessing about it, we'll just call for an end by 2025. Because we just didn't have the power over Ameren to say, you got to keep offering this indefinitely. They rolled us on that one. Yeah, the MC Squared solar farm, MC Squared they're still building community solar farms too. I'm not sure, I'll have to look for that link. I'm not sure what their discount is. Sell back at a reduced price. I mean, that's kind of the battle we're going through with the publicly owned utilities. You can, what they call avoided costs. So if you live in a municipal utility, they will compensate you, say, 3 cents per kilowatt hour. But there are also benefits to the grid of people generating their own electricity. I mean, it takes the stress off of the distribution system. So there is a benefit to individual solar generation that I think should be reflected in what people are credited.
So Scott, I know when we initially talked about having you come on, there are legislative things coming up this fall in the veto section and going forward that CUB is giving information about. What are those and what would you encourage people to do?
I think like I said, the carbon capture stuff is coming up, and I think keeping in touch and like letting you all know, like Mark sending a notice to you, like what's going on. And then when we see the building decarbonization stuff, the gas, like that's going to be a big fight with gas. Just the most effective thing that people can do, and it sounds kind of weak and relying totally on like this small engagement, but calling state representatives, because even if your state representative is like, well, yeah, of course they're on board with this. They say all the time about like, it kind of emboldens them to stick with their choices when they hear from their constituents, like, hey, we like what you're doing. And it gives them more courage to push back against a lot of the less active, I guess, representatives down here. So I'd be happy, Mark, to pass along anything I know about this, and you can share it to everybody and make sure to get the word out.
Yeah. So what we should do is, keep our contact with CUB, Citizens Utility Board, find out from them what's going on, and if there are actions we need to take, we do that. I need to send in a membership to CUB again, and I do support them. I'm really glad that they're there, and thanks to Pat Quinn for getting CUB into the state. Anybody else have any comments? Paul Culhane is with Sierra Club Northwest. He might have some suggestions to what we might do. Paul, have you got any suggestions?
When you started talking about nuclear, I was trying to resist the temptation to jump in about Mark Walker, and I think I'll continue to resist. The short version is we were lobbying him about our set of bills, and he sprung his bill honest, before we'd ever heard of it, but don't get me started. I put my one comment in there that the problem with nuclear is it's so expensive. They just completed a plant down in Georgia, billions of dollars over budget, years late. It's a doofus way to try and go to deal with energy. Much better to go with renewables.
Well, and if you really want to scare yourself, take a look at what's happening at Hanford, which continues to fester, and it's a Chernobyl waiting to happen. And we pump billions of dollars from Department of Energy in that, and nothing is cleaned up there. It's sitting, bubbling away, and it's a horrible problem. So, but what, any other legislation, Scott, that's coming up that we should be looking at, or, you know, we can find out from you guys, I guess. So
those the pieces that I talked about with the carbon capture stuff this fall, in the spring session, a transparency requirements for publicly owned utilities, the what we refer to generally as clean like better heat bill, with trying to electrify and fuel switch. Those are the three major pieces of legislation. I have a better idea though, and I'm happy to come back anytime. When veto session is over, I think we'll start hearing some rumors about how the lawmakers are feeling for the spring session, because they're very touchy about this. And there's this wisdom that you can only pass one major energy bill every 5 years, which we don't have the time to wait for that. So we're going to need to step it up a little bit and get rid of that wisdom.
well, the IRA money that's coming down the pike is huge.
It is.
We need to be, you know, planning on how to get that distributed in the best way to the best people. Are there other sources any of you on this call look to? You could look at the National Renewable Energy Lab in Golden, Colorado has an interesting site to look at. That's one of the federal government's labs that's doing stuff like this and has been for a long time. There are things like that you can look to that, you know, give you some positives that go, oh, gee, I didn't know that was happening. Let's take a look at that. Any other ideas? I know I need to get Paul Culhane to come on again in one of these programs. And just saying, next month, I'm not going to be available. My son's getting married around the end of the month, so and my relatives are coming. So I think what I'm going to do for our next climate thing next month is to promote the solar tour people thing that's going on. And I don't know if any of you are participating in that. Paul, are you? Paul is. So I don't know. Maybe somebody we can promote that on our website. So anything else here? It's there's a new question, Carrie. New, small, and safer, less expensive. The nuclear thorium nuclear reactors show some promise. And our national labs are doing tremendous research into stuff. So who knows what's going to come? I mean, different types of batteries, iron, sulfur battery technology. Some interesting things are coming. It's changing while we sit here.
Definitely. Yeah, and I'm happy to come back anytime, or anybody else from Cub too. Like, there are people at Cub far smarter than I am. So
Yeah, well, you know, we've had Sarah on, and I've talked to Mara Minnick and Marina Minnick, and we need, if something comes up and you need to let us know, please do. So, and but anyway, Scott, thanks for coming on.
Thank you so much for having me. This is really, really nice to talk to you.
Yep, keep in touch. And if Bill, do you have any final comments?
Scott, to you, thank you so much. Mark, always appreciate what you do for us.
Thanks,
Thanks,
Scott.
everybody.
Thanks, Bill. Good night, everybody.